Hooray. I'm so bad at tech, you're going to find out. So I'm relieved that it said recording is in progress. So, so there, like we were saying, there's probably 8 or 9 key questions. We're going to try and tackle 4. They're in no particular order. I have done this once before for fire. I'm not sure if we've got the recordings somewhere. I've probably got them on my laptop actually. And so these are a different 4 to what we did last time, but we'd have to probably, that was early days. I'm not sure if the church had officially even started. I was just kind of more doing it off my own back. But the 4 we wanted to cover this time tonight is about historicity. So we're looking at questions of how does Christianity line up with history? Like, 1, was Jesus actually a historical person? We need to check out, is he real or is he just this cute figure somebody made up and it fitted nicely with religion? Or can we pin it down to historical fact? Same with the Bible. Like, plenty of people will, you hear all the time, oh, the Bible's been changed over the years. Such an ignorant comment, but everyone just believes it. So we're going to do a little bit of homework on that and see that that's not the case. And the Bible can absolutely be historically verifiable as not changed. But popular opinion says it has been changed. You can't listen to it. And people just hear that. I suppose that's what they want to hear, so they listen to it. And the other one, I doubt we'll have time to get to this, but possibly the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. Like, we're looking not just at the Bible, but we're looking at external documents written by non-Christians, by the historians of the time. And we're doing the same stuff as if you put someone on trial today and you went to court, you would go and interview the eyewitnesses. And that's how we establish truth. So that's what we're doing in these questions, particularly about Jesus and the resurrection. We're checking the historical documents, the eyewitnesses at the time, what did they say happened, and establishing truth by the same method that we would be willing to put someone in jail for the rest of their life by this method. So it's just a method we use to establish truth now. So we're using that in looking at Jesus. The limitation of what we're doing too, I probably need to say something about. People kind of get upset with this. If you wanted the technical name for what we're doing, this is called apologetics. I don't know if you've come across that word before, which is a Greek word. Sophia, you will know it being Greek. Apologetics, a reasoned defense is what it means. 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be prepared to give the reason for the hope that lies within you. And it's that word apologetic. So it's talking about a thought through, a reasoned defense. Why do you believe this? Give defense for it, give good, intelligent reason. So it's actually a command in the Bible that we should know these things and, have a sensible, intelligent answer for people. But probably before that, it's a sensible, intelligent answer for ourselves too. I guess different people come to faith different ways. And I don't think this is what, like, having all the answers answered, or the questions answered, I should say, won't turn you into a Christian. But I think it can remove some of the roadblocks. For me, I had questions about Christianity, things I didn't like. And this is kind of cool since I'm talking to girls. I really didn't like the attitude of Christians towards women. And there were things I needed to check out that I had heard how Christians responded to women, how they limited their opportunities. And I had to go and do some study on that and try and understand it, and found what I'd been told was wrong. So that was kind of an apologetic thing. It was an intellectual barrier that I had put up against Christianity. And then from there, I started looking at the very thing we're looking at tonight. Was Jesus a historical person? Now, although I answered my questions to the point of satisfaction, but it's still a spiritual transaction, isn't it? You get to, sorry, just letting Craig in here. You get to a point where it's not just a head question. There's a transaction going on in your heart, in your spirit. In John 3, Jesus talks to Nicodemus, who's a brilliant scholar, and he says to him, look, this is a spiritual transaction. You're not going to get this sorted out just in your head. It's a spirit to spirit thing. But I think this really can help. Whether you're coming to faith and you want to check those blockages, see if, like, is this legit? I'm not putting my life on the line if for something that's just a bunch of fairy stories or nice sweet talk of grandmas over the back fence, anything like that. You want to check it out before you're going to put your whole life on the line. So that's important. For some people, removing the intellectual barriers. But for us, as far as I know, everyone here is a believer. There can be nagging doubts in your head that you just haven't resolved, and they can undermine your faith and hold you back from going the whole way into it. So I think finding these answers is helpful for that reason. It's also helpful in terms of having a quality answer for friends, where we're sharing our faith. Number one, so we don't feel nervous. Oh, they're going to ask me this question. I'm going to panic and be embarrassed and look like an idiot. It's good to have some basic answers down so we don't look like dummies, but also that they might really be helped by what we say, to see that we've thought things through. Now, I would say you don't have to have all the answers to share your faith either. You can always say, you know what? I don't know about that one. It's never bothered me, but I'll go and find out an answer for you. I still do that. I'd happily do that now if someone asked me a curly question. Just knowing that there are good answers too can really help us. Anyway, so much for an introduction. So I'm going to rip into the history stuff now. First up here in the notes, I've got the historicity of Jesus. Was Jesus an actual, real, historical person, or is he just like a figment of a religious imagination? Is he a myth? Is he a cute story that somebody made up? Well, the good news is we've got so much information covered from people who weren't Christians that verify a lot of the key points of Christianity. So if you look at that table in the notes, I've lifted this from a book by Dr. Paul Barnett called Is the New Testament History? But he lists out 9 key facts here that are all from external documents. So we're not looking inside the Bible to confirm the Bible. We're looking at professional historians of the day, governmental figures, politicians who wrote about Jesus and the early Christians in that time, and we're seeing what they've got to say. And remarkably, it verifies a lot of the key facts. So let's just whip through those. So in that table, I've got the fact verified and where it comes from. So fact number 1, Jesus was executed by crucifixion in Judea during the period when Tiberius was emperor, which is AD 14 to 37. That's exactly right. He's probably crucified. They think there's an error in the Gregorian calendar. That's a bit of a story. So it probably works out to AD 33, but somewhere between AD 30 and 33 is when Jesus is crucified. So, and Tacitus, who is the Roman governor of Asia from 55 to 120, and he's writing about the fire of Rome in AD 64, verifies all these things. He says Jesus Christ was executed by crucifixion in Judea. So straight up, we know that's not, there's a guy, Jesus, who was crucified under Tiberius, and Pontius Pilate was the governor. It's pretty good info. You've given us a lot of information straight up. The second fact, the movement spread from Bithynia, which is the northwest of the Mediterranean, to Rome. Again, the Roman governor Tacitus records that. Fact 3, Jesus claimed to be God and that he would depart and return. Eliezer, a Jewish rabbi, so you understand the Jewish rabbis, they want to disprove Christianity. They don't want to prove that Jesus is the right guy. He was the enemy to them. He's a fake Messiah, so they want to get rid of him. But Eliezer, writing against Christians in about AD 90, said that Jesus claimed to be God and that he would depart and return again. Fact 4, his followers worshipped him as God or a god. So Pliny, the governor of Bithynia, writing to the Emperor Trajan. So we're going pretty high. These are serious documents being passed to the Roman Emperor. In AD 112, he wrote to ask how to deal with the troublesome Christians. Like he wanted to go kill them all. And he records that Jesus' followers worshipped him as God. Fact 5, he was called the Christ. Josephus, who was an aristocratic Jew, who he was employed by the Romans to write a history of the Jews so that they could understand Jewish culture. Sorry, just got to admit someone else here. There we go. So Josephus says he was called the Christ. Fact 6, his followers were called Christians. Tacitus and Pliny both record that. They were numerous in both Bithynia and Rome. Tacitus, Pliny, and Suetonius, another Roman writer who's from 69 to about 140. Fact 8, it was a worldwide movement. Again, Eliezer, the rabbi, Jewish rabbi, records that. The last one is interesting, and this is probably the most commonly known guy, Josephus, that we've already mentioned, the Jewish historian, but he's writing a Jewish history in the employ of the Romans. He records that his brother was James. I actually went and bought this history book before I became a Christian because of this quote. Josephus records that Jesus was a doer of miracles and that he appeared alive again after execution. That's in a non-Christian's history, a Jewish history. However, how people get around that is history scholars say, well, this could be a later edit. You know, a Christian later on down the centuries has added this into the text. So they don't normally accept that part as original. I don't know that there's really good grounds to reject it, but it is just because the claims are so outrageous that he's a doer of miracles and he appears alive again after execution is pretty full on. And they just say, well, a Jewish historian wouldn't say that. And they write it off on that basis. However, you've got a lot of info there confirming a lot of the basic facts of the story of Jesus, hey, in those, even in those first 9 facts. Do you want to ask any questions about that before I go any further? All pretty straightforward. Were you aware of that info or surprising?
Yeah, I think it was cool to actually just like hear it straight. It's like you can know these things your whole life, you can believe them from like a faith level or a perspective of faith, but like to actually like, yeah, hear like the pen to paper kind of stuff like is actually really
Yeah,
cool.
I love it. I remember the first time I read it, I was already convinced that Jesus was real, but then you're looking in the history books from outside the Bible, from people that don't have, well, they don't just not have a bias towards Christianity, they're antagonistic, yet they've recorded all the key, well, I shouldn't say all the key, a lot of the key facts, like enough to just looking at those 9 things, you go, wow, like that gives you most of the Gospels. You've kind of got the message there and the history of how it spread, which is amazing. So there's good reason to be confident about. I don't think any serious historian would say that Jesus wasn't an actual historical figure. Of course, they'll dispute that he did miracles and he rose from the dead because they've got a predisposition to say these things don't happen. You know, your scientific mindset dictates miracles don't happen. People don't come back from the dead. So, of course, they're not going to go, yeah, that's true. But absolutely no doubt, no serious historian would say Jesus didn't exist. They say he was a real historical person who was executed under Roman rule. So pretty encouraging stuff. If we go a little bit further, the second table, this is from Gary Habermas in a book called The Reliability of the Gospels. You can pick up these books if they're things that you'd like to have on your shelf. I guess I'm a bit of a book nerd. I like having them on my shelf, having the resources there. Anyway, he mentions that there are 16 separate sources which confirm the New Testament as accurate historical records of the person and work of Jesus. So we just got 9 facts, now 16 separate sources which give us those facts. So again, all historians, or I should be careful. No, they're not all historians, but all key major players in history. So Thales, he wrote around 50 AD, and he wrote a 3-volume history. So 50 AD is pretty early. We're still in the lifetime of the apostles. Everyone's still alive at this point. And he writes, reporting the darkness that surrounded the world after Jesus' crucifixion, and he explained it by saying it was an eclipse of the sun. I don't know if it was or it wasn't, but it's pretty convenient right as Jesus dies to have an eclipse of the sun. If that's all the miracle is, that's still pretty impressive. God lined up that one pretty well. Julius Africanus, he also records Thales's statement, but he disputes that there could have been an eclipse. He lived from, Julius was from 160 to 240 AD, so he's much later and he's after the time of the apostles, but he was a Greek historian. So even the fact he's quoting Thales is again giving credibility to Thales, I guess. It's a history that's stood for 100 years already. If we go to Josephus, who we've already mentioned, I've mentioned that passage where he says, okay, Jesus taught virtuous conduct, that he had both Jewish and Gentile followers. He performed miracles, fulfilled prophecy, was crucified under Pilate. His disciples also reported that Jesus had risen from the dead and appeared to them 3 days later. And I've got that reference written there. You could probably go to just about any library and I reckon they'd have a copy of Josephus because it's a significant Jewish history. And you could look up Antiquities 18:3 and find all that for yourself. Josephus was born in 37 AD, so he's writing this again. True, the apostles and the early Christians could show up and say, no, this is rubbish. This is not true. That's not what happened. The people involved could dispute it, but there is no dispute. So we've got somebody making their living as a historian who's antagonistic towards Christianity, doing us a favor and recording much of the stuff that we actually want to know is true. So it's quite objective in that way. You know, it's not in-house a Christian going, of course, Jesus is the guy. Just the opposite. It's really good quality information. Tacitus and his contemporary Suetonius provided other significant information about Jesus and his followers. For example, writing around 112 AD, Tacitus notes that Jesus Christ was killed by Pontius Pilate while Tiberius was the Roman emperor. But after his death, Christian teachings had spread to Rome itself. There, Christians were considered criminals and tortured in a variety of ways, including crucifixions. Suetonius also reports that Christians were punished during the reign of Nero, and I've got both the references. Again, you can go and look those books up and check those facts for yourself. Pliny and Emperor Trajan. So we've covered some of these before, but now we're talking about the 16 different sources of history. Pliny, a Roman governor in Bithynia, wrote to Emperor Trajan about 120 AD and requested advice for treating believers who worship Jesus but refused to worship the gods. Because you understand, for a Roman, the gods were, like a whole heap of them that, well, they were the Roman gods. And you were called an atheist if you didn't believe in the Roman god. So they would have said the Christians were in effect atheists because they denied the Roman gods. So Pliny requested advice for treating the Christians who worship Jesus but refused to worship the gods. Pliny described weekly gatherings of Christians who were drawn from all ages and social classes, who met before dawn and sang hymns to Christ as a deity and agreed not to sin. The Roman governor required that Christians be killed unless they denied Christ and worshipped the gods. Trajan explained that Pliny was taking a little too far his program of persecution. Again, you can go look that up. Eusebius and the Emperor Hadrian. Later, Emperor Hadrian also wrote a letter noting that Christians might have to be punished, but also encouraged a bit of restraint. Lucian, another Gentile evaluation of Jesus and the church, was written by the Greek satirist Lucian of Samosata. Lucian wrote that Jesus taught the brotherhood of believers and that Christians should deny the gods and obey his laws. Lucian explains that Christians did not fear death due to being persuaded that they were immortal. Moreover, they shared their material possessions with each other and frequently read from scripture. The Talmud, which is basically Jewish commentaries on the Old Testament. So the Jewish scholars writing on things. Some later sources, like the Jewish Talmud and several Gnostic writings. So the Gnostics were like a Christian sect who believed, probably like current New Agers, who believed they had special insight and spiritual revelations that other people didn't have. And they sort of became this cult group, this breakaway group from Christianity. One of the most interesting reports is from the earliest reference to Jesus in the Talmud, that reports that Jesus was hanged, which is a term used in Galatians and Luke, on the eve of the Passover, that he was hanged on a cross. Initially, the Jews were going to stone Jesus for leading Israel astray. Anyone who wished to could defend Jesus, but no one volunteered. And we're not told why Jesus was hanged. Ignatius and Clement, who are regarded as the early church fathers, so early key leaders in Christianity. Several post-New Testament Christian writings also mention various details regarding the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Some of these works, like Clement of Rome's Corinthians and Ignatius's 7 epistles, were written at a very early date, immediately after the New Testament era, from 95 to 115 AD. Quite significantly, these writers may have even been acquaintances of the apostles. Because, for instance, John dies, they reckon, between 98 and 100 AD. So these people are alive. They start writing at 95. So John could have even still been alive at this time. So they are in the time where this actually happened. They're not people, the accusations often made against Christianity, it was people looking back hundreds of years, and they talk about oral tradition like Chinese whispers, like, that game you play at school and you start off with a story, Bob caught a fish, and you get to the end of the line and it's Mary had Chinese for dinner. It's nothing like it. That's what's proposed of how the New Testament's changed. But we know that's not true because there's no gap in years for it to change. These things are written while the apostles are still alive. So there was a chance, and not just the apostles, but thousands and thousands of Christians, tens of thousands by this time. We know there's 3,000 on the day of Pentecost. So I don't know, maybe hundreds of thousands that could have refuted it, and they didn't. Nobody refuted it. In fact, they suffered brutal deaths, saying it was true. If it was all rubbish, it's really hard to imagine that Christians would consistently allow themselves to be executed and no one said, no, I was only joking. He didn't really come back from the dead, and wasn't really, no, I was just tricking. He didn't do any miracles. Like if you're about to get sawn in half or set on fire, or Nero's favorite trick is he'd cover people in pitch and set them on fire and use them for garden torches, like just absolutely brutal death. Surely somebody would have cracked and said I was kidding. But you've got huge volumes of Christians saying this is true, testifying it with their life. All right, so I think that's all the 16. Yeah, that gives us our 16 sources. So we've got 9 key facts covered and 16 different historical sources about Jesus. Sorry, I must be forcing my voice. I'm losing my voice already. All right, a couple of other things we could consider with historicity. Luke 1, 1 to 3. Luke's my favorite gospel. Seems like everyone amongst our crew at church loves John. I got a reason why I love Luke, and this is why. Luke 1, 1 to 3. I'll read it for you. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses. Remember that word, eyewitnesses, and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, carefully investigated, eyewitnesses, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So his reason for writing is certainty. He said that in verse 4. He's writing an orderly account. He's interviewing eyewitnesses, people that actually saw it with their own eyes, not my friend's grandma's budgie whistled it and I thought, yeah, that sounds good, I'll write it down. He went to the eyewitnesses. So going back to the place where we started, he's using the same procedure that we would use today. We'd call it the historico-legal method. So if you go to court, this is how we find someone guilty or not guilty and send them to jail forever. By this method, we go back to eyewitnesses, don't we? And we examine them and test if it's true. Okay. So we've looked at the external stuff. We're now looking at some of the internal indications of historicity. So can we look in the New Testament and find that anything there that would suggest that this is history? So there's one. Luke, who's a doctor, he's a highly educated man for his time, does an orderly history and he goes to eyewitnesses. That helps us. Scholars who, like literary scholars, often say, if you've got a myth, the good guys are always the good guys. They're pretty one-dimensional. They don't do terrible things. There's not confusing things. Perhaps the hero has a fatal flaw and he gets killed, but they pretty much, the good guys remain the good guys. But in the Gospels, literary critics are impressed by the fact that no one's one-dimensional. And some of the things that happen are not how you would write the story. For instance, when Jesus says things like, unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you can't follow me. Like if you're making up a story, you're probably not going to slip that one in there. And the fact that many people turned back at that point, lots of the believers walked away. If you're writing a myth, you probably edit that bit out. Or lovely, gentle, caring Jesus going to the temple and, blasting all the shopkeepers and smashing all their tables, getting a whip and driving them out of the temple. You probably wouldn't put that in there for the good guy either. You also probably wouldn't have the disciples continually being such irritating dummies and not understanding who Jesus was. You'd think you'd write him in as going, oh, yeah, of course, Jesus. We saw that yesterday. And yeah, we know you can do that. But they just don't get it, do they? The whole way through. Even to the point of Peter, who becomes a hero in Acts, denying Jesus 3 times. You wouldn't think you'd put, like, if you're making a compelling argument for Jesus as the Son of God and you want to convince people to hand over their lives, you're not going to put one of his top 3 guys as denying him and disbelieving. And then later on going, oh, skip this Christian thing, I'm going fishing. Being disappointed when Jesus is executed and thinking it's all over. So non-Christian literary scholars are impressed by that fact. It's not typical to a myth. One of the most recent challenges to a history, I know this was a big issue, it's probably going back a bit for you guys, when the Da Vinci Code came out, it caused quite a stir. And people latched onto that. Oh, yeah, the church has just manufactured all this stuff and it's been changed through the histories and through history. And people would not hear that that was not the case. It was like the movie and the book gave them the info that they wanted to grab onto, and they said, see, this is true. The problem is the Da Vinci Code is not based on fact. And where it went looking for its information is just bogus places historically. For instance, they based some of their ideas, well, they claimed that the church suppressed other gospels. So there are other biographies of Jesus. That is true. There's like other gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas and so forth. But there's problems with those gospels. There's a reason why they're not included in the New Testament, and that is because they're not history. First off, they're pseudonymous. They're given a fake name. The Gospel of Thomas, like written in 300 AD, well, Thomas was well and truly dead long before 300 AD. It's not Thomas writing a gospel at all, but it's written as though it is. So fake names, you would have to question that straight up. A late date of writing, they're written hundreds of years after the eyewitnesses. We've just shown how the Gospels included in the New Testament are dealing with eyewitnesses. They've got the facts from the people that were there. These Gnostic Gospels, the other Gospels, are too late for that to be the case. And then a couple of hundred years later, they suddenly produce material that conflicts with the eyewitnesses. Now, isn't it a bit strange that hundreds of years later they contradict the eyewitnesses? Who would you tend to listen to? Like if we were investigating a car crash in Palm Beach that happened in 2023, well, let's do it differently. Let's say in 1990, we're investigating the case. Would we listen to someone who was there at the scene in 1990? Or would we ask someone who said in 2024, no, this is what I heard? What's going to have more credibility? Too easy, isn't it? So the problem with these Gnostic Gospels is they're just bogus. So the whole of the Da Vinci Code idea was just, it was based on pseudonymous books, late date of writing, suddenly producing dodgy material. And I've got a little example there. The Gospel of Thomas has Jesus saying, oh, I've written that wrong, sorry. He will make Mary into a man, sorry, not a woman. He'll make Mary into a man so she can be saved. Totally conflicts with everything else in the other biographies we have of Jesus teaching. All right, maybe what about we stop there? So that's looking at the historicity of Jesus. Anyone want to ask questions about any of that? Because we're going to go on to the historicity. I put the Bible there. I actually should have put the New Testament, not the Bible, because we're more focused on that. Thoughts or
Wes,
questions? Yeah.
I've actually like hearing this info, I just remembered when I was in the New Age, there was a book going around called Mary Magdalene Revealed. Have you ever heard
Okay.
of that book?
No, I haven't. Sorry.
So basically, it's like the first apostle, it's all based around like Mary Magdalene, but
Okay.
they try to say that these are like archived documents, right? That it's like Mary's gospel, I guess. Yeah, I never read much of it, but I have seen like this has made its way into the New Age community, and it's just getting really popular and loud. And so I'm just,
Yeah.
yeah, wondered if you had heard about it.
I haven't heard of that one, but there are a lot of them.
Mm.
Pretty, I'm sure you would have heard in the New Age too. There's all sorts of theories that Jesus married Mary Magdalene and they had
Yeah.
babies and moved to India or something, but there's no historical facts and it contradicts established history, the reputable historians, eyewitnesses, again, who would you trust?
Mm.
There's all sorts of motivations that people have to publish other stuff. And if it's hundreds of years later, you just straight up, you're going to question it.
Yeah,
So
so cool.
be happy to check that out though.
Yeah, because like I said, like I know that it's gotten very popular and I know a lot of people, I had it, I just couldn't like get into it. It just felt
Yeah.
completely wrong to me. And like this was still when I was still even in the new age. But yeah, like even the
So
titles like her,
Gospel of,
it's
oh,
called
what have I done
Mary
with my,
Magdalene Revealed. I can text it to you.
I'll write it
But
down now and I'll check it out. Gospel of Mary Magdalene.
yeah, so it's called Mary Magdalene Revealed.
Okay.
It's meant to be like, yeah, her feminist gospel and the
Yeah.
Christianity we haven't yet tried is like how they summarize it.
Yeah. Well, the same three things could be leveled against all these. They've got no basis in history. They're written late. They're pseudonymous. Why would you trust? Like,
Mm.
if it just shows the heart intent of people, like where they're coming from, like, because the gospels that are in the New Testament are verifiable historically and they're based on eyewitness testimony. Why would you reject eyewitness testimony and go to something much later, like the very things they're accusing the New Testament of being changed and being fake and mythological? They're much happier to go to another gospel that's definitely those things. So to me, it just shows the headspace of the person. They just looking, they don't want this to be true, and they'll go to something that says something else, even if it doesn't have verifiable fact. Excuse me, got to get rid of this jumper. Heating up. But I'll check it out, get some more info on it. I'll have to admit, I haven't spent a lot of time looking at it just because I think they're just completely discredited on those 3 points. Like, why would I bother? Any other thoughts or questions before we go into historicity of the New Testament? Okay. Feel free to like email me any other questions if things come up or you don't want to ask in front of everybody. It's all good. Historicity of the New Testament. So obviously, we as Christians shape our lives around what the New Testament says. So if it's dodgy, if it's contradicts itself internally, if it can be disproven externally by, say, things like archaeology, or if things like the prophecies prove to be fake, let's all do ourselves a favor and ditch being Christians right now. Because you don't want to spend your life like this book tells us about things that other people would consider sacrifices. We should ditch it if it's not true. So let's have a look at it. Does the Bible contradict itself? Like, is it disqualified internally? Does history contradict the Bible? Sorry, let's swap all these to the New Testament. Does the New Testament contradict itself? Does history contradict the New Testament? Hasn't the Bible just evolved like Chinese whispers? So we started on these things. Let's have a look. All right. First up, doesn't the New Testament contradict itself? Isn't it disqualified by internal contradictions? Like, it's got to say this. It can't say the moon is white and the moon is black, can it? Both things can't be true. So we got to look in there and say, does it disqualify itself just by contradiction? Basic law of logic. So the first thing you need to know is there are things that might look like contradictions. Are you scared now? And the best place to go find them is in what's called the synoptic gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke. They're called the synoptics, like synonymous. They use the same material. John, the Gospel of John is a little bit different. It's more of theology. It's more developed to present who Jesus is and give you a more theological understanding. Matthew, Mark, and Luke deal with the same material. They're looking at much more straight biography. They've got slightly different emphases. Matthew's is written probably more for Jews. It incorporates a lot of Hebrew language and reflects to the Old Testament a lot. Mark is probably the common man's gospel, written by Mark the fisherman in really basic language. And Luke's is much more an intelligent guy. I think Luke was probably Greek, and he's writing probably a more scholarly document, more typical history. But we need to look and see, it's basically the same material, and they recorded a lot of the same events. So we need to check out, do they contradict each other? I'm going to show you some problems. Before I send you into a panic, they're easily resolved, but on the surface, they look like problems. So I've got 3 examples there. The first example is an easy one. So it's the matter of how many women and which women went to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body. So Matthew says Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Mark says Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of James, and Salome. Luke says Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of James, Joanna, and others. But it's easy to resolve, because just because they put down some names didn't mean that they were giving a complete list of everybody who was there. Maybe they listed the key players, they listed the ones that were important to them, the ones they thought were central. We can see all of them list Mary Magdalene and then a second Mary, and then there's some other people that the different writers. So it doesn't mean that they're contradicting each other, they're just recording some extra people. Again, if we go back to our idea of a car crash, if you have a car crash on an intersection and you have people on each corner giving an account of what happened, like, you'd take all those stories and you'd get the full picture, wouldn't you? Like, they're all seeing the same event from different angles. So that's what happens there. We've got the same event from different angles. Sorry, I'm having a lot of troubles with my throat tonight. So that's an easy one. The second example is harder. Let's look at who the women met at the tomb. Matthew says an angel. Sounds like just one angel. Mark says a young man in a white robe. Luke says 2 men in clothes gleaming like lightning. And John says 2 angels in white. Again, it's not too hard to resolve. Hebrews 13:2 says, many have entertained angels unaware, so they can look like people. And it would be easy, again, if we go to our car crash in the intersection, or even the idea that we've seen with the list, maybe one angel spoke, and so they the writer focused in on that person. A young man in a white robe, that one's probably, some angels can look quite human. And then the others, 2 men in clothes gleaming like lightning and 2 angels in white, they sound the same. So a little harder, but still not unresolvable. If we go to the third example, I remember being a brand new Christian and stumbling across this, doing my quiet time in the Gospels, and this troubled me, this one. I read in Matthew 27 that it said Judas hanged himself. And then in Acts 1:18, it says Judas fell headlong and his body burst open and his intestines spilled out. I'm like, what? They sound like quite different things, would you agree? So how did Judas die? It really rattled me, because I was a brand new Christian. I think I'm like 2 weeks in. I'm like, what? This Bible is a heap of crap. There's 2 different things. This is a complete contradiction. What's the story? And when I thought about it, I thought, you know what? Maybe that's not that hard. And I came up with my own answer before I did my further research. And I thought, well, what if he did hang himself? What if he's hanging on a branch and later on, the branch snaps. He's probably going to fall on the ground and his body burst open and his intestines spill out. So what killed him? Could have been the hanging, could have been the intestines spilling out, whatever it was. Neither of them were very good for him, and he wound up dead. And it all would depend on when you showed up or what part of the story you wanted to record. So that one's a little bit harder. You have to think a little bit more, and that's a generally accepted solution. Any questions about those? Do they rattle you at all, or they seem fairly easy? We're all okay? No one, I can't see flames coming off anyone's Bible or walking off. We're all good. The good news is that's about as hard as it gets. So it's not the end of the world with the contradictions. They're the hardest ones. So that's looking at, are there internal contradictions? What about, does history contradict the New Testament? We've already seen some of that, haven't we, in looking at the historicity of the person of Jesus. What we find is history doesn't contradict the Bible, but rather it backs it up. And we've already seen it backs it up from even antagonistic sources. We can look at things like prophecies in the Bible are incredibly accurate. I should have dug out some probability of some of the prophecies of Jesus being possible. It's just mind-blowing, just impossible statistics. Those of you who were at church a few weeks ago, I read out Psalm 22. I think Christy had made a comment about Psalm 22, and I read a section which has got just incredible detail about the crucifixion of Jesus from 500 or 600 years before. Or if you read Psalm 52, Isaiah 52 and 53, also incredible detail. You'd think they would have to be there to record the details, you know, like the lashings being pierced through his legs not being broken. Incredible detail. So the prophecies back up the history of the Bible. Also, archaeology is continually finding that the Bible is historically accurate. Many places mention the Bible were thought to be mythological until archaeologists accidentally dug them up. So continually being confirmed. And so you're getting it from a professional and not me. University of Chicago professor Raymond Bowman, confirms the surprise of archaeologists when he said, the archaeological confirmation of the biblical narrative at most points has led to a new respect for biblical tradition and a more conservative view of biblical history. Jewish scholar Nelson Glueck says no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a single properly understood biblical statement. So both those guys are huge academics who are not going to risk their reputation and their university posts on making outrageous statements, and they say archaeology backs up the Bible. All right. I'm going to go into the idea about the Chinese whispers thing a little bit more. Like, hasn't the Bible just evolved sort of like Chinese whispers as it's been passed down the line? Because this comes out all the time. The accurate transmission of the Bible can be proved in a number of ways. The first thing that you want to do is get a really old text, like if we could go back to 50 AD, get our first Bible or first New Testament document. I shouldn't say there wasn't a New Testament compiled at that point. So we get our Gospel of Mark is probably the earliest in about AD 65 or something. We got that, and we got our Bible today, put them together and compare, are they the same? That would settle it for us, wouldn't it? We could show that there hasn't been huge change. Well, the good news is for us in our time, in the 1940s through the 1950s, there was a series of discoveries of things called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Have you ever come across that term before? They're a series of just hundreds and hundreds of scrolls that were put inside pottery jars in a cave in the Middle East. First one was found when a little shepherd boy threw a rock into a cave and he heard something break, something shatter. And across the next about 10, 15 years, they were pulling these scrolls out of that area from what had been a commune at a place called Qumran. There's some thought that John the Baptist may have even been raised in this commune at Qumran. They were a Christian group called the Essenes, Christian Jewish group. And in a huge volume of scrolls, which range in date from 300 years before Christ, we have a full copy of the manuscript of Isaiah, the whole book from 300 years before Christ, and you compare it to the time of Christ, perfect, no difference. Right through to the 1st century AD documents. And you compare all these Dead Sea Scrolls to current New Testament, it's exactly the same. So you've got a 1,000-year span there. Sorry, not 1,000 years, getting myself confused. We've got a long span of time to prove that these documents are unchanged. So when we compare the old documents to the new documents, there's no significant change. I say no significant change because there are things like spelling mistakes, which probably aren't hugely, well, they make no difference to theology. Might have spelled Robbie with an S on the end, something like that, or 1B. They just don't affect any points of theology. There are 2 parts of the New Testament that have question marks, and I'm going to show them to you. There's no secret about them. If you go to the end of Mark's Gospel, if you've got a Bible handy, there's no secret cover-up or anything. The end of Mark's Gospel, we're just not sure where it finishes. You'll see, I'm looking at an NIV, so you may have a different Bible. If you go to Mark 16, you'll see written in the text, the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16, 9 to 20. Can you see that in the text of your Bible? So there's no cover-up. The people that are getting the ancient documents and formatting our New Testament for us are going, we're not completely sure about this. And the theory is that, like, they're all written on scrolls and parchments. The Christians are getting persecuted, chased down and killed. Somebody's bolting with a manuscript and a bit gets ripped off the end. And somebody else says, I can remember what was there. And they try to write an approximation. So Mark 16, 9 to 20 is thought, you can look at it one of 2 ways. If you want to look at it as a textual critic, somebody that examines documents, you would say, I can't be 100% sure about 9 to 20. We're not sure about that. It seems to use slightly different vocabulary to the rest of Mark, which would make you uncertain. A few other reasons like that. So we're not certain about that, but no one's hiding it, are they? They've written it straight in the text. Now, why this is important, I hope I've got oh, good, I have got a texter. Can you, if I write on my whiteboard, I didn't mirror my screen. I don't know if this will come out right. Oh, it'll still work. Okay, let's go. No, if you, can you see that at all, ABC? Okay. Let's imagine these are 3 early people. They got the Gospel of Mark, very first one, and they started copying out. So this one gets the Gospel of Mark. How do I explain this? Okay, how it works is, let's go back to my example of Robbie with 1B. This guy Well, let's do a Y. That'll work better. And the next people. All right. This is how you figure out what the right text is. You want to find the oldest, the older the document, the more reliable it is, because the more times it gets copied, the error is going to continue. So if you were able to get a date on the early one, like you want to go the earliest ones because there's less likely to be a chance of a mistake. So there are things that happen in the transmission of the text that are like this. But they're only at that level. Now, whether Robbie spelt with an I, a Y, or an IE is not going to affect my faith. But there are things like that. That's the honest truth. Someone copying by hand, they make a mistake. But it's nothing about theology. No one's got in there Jesus wasn't really God or he didn't rise from the dead. It's just very simple mistakes. And I've just shown you the biggest area of uncertainty. And the reason why they say that, why that is, all right. So imagine we're doing this. We stop. We've got an early one, stops, Mark 8. Where's it? Sorry, Mark 16, 8. And so on and so on, stops, Mark 16, 8. And all of a sudden, we get one that's got some extra verses. So how would you, now that you're a PhD in textual criticism, how would you pick out which document is likely to be right, looking at that? Should be easy. Like this is time. So it's always going to be the earliest one, isn't it? Because there's less chance of mistakes. And if Mark 9 to 20 shows up, 100 years down the track, you're probably going to lean towards saying that might not be original. And going back to the theory that I mentioned, it seems like the end of the scroll has been ripped off and somebody's tried to substitute, someone's tried to remember what was there, but there's question marks about it because the vocabulary is slightly different to other, like there's a couple of words that aren't used anywhere else in Mark. It just looks a little bit different. It's got some slightly different ideas. So it could be that that was an inaccurate reproduction. Okay, that's one way you could look at it. Or you could say, no, I believe that God would get the New Testament through to us in 100% accuracy. You can make a faith statement. I'm going to say that bit, I don't know. And I wouldn't build any doctrines from Mark 16, 9 to 20 unless I could see them elsewhere. One of the things that makes people question is verse 18 that says, they will pick up snakes with their hands, and when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. Well, we haven't seen anyone drink deadly poison anywhere else in the New Testament. And then there's no other mention of that. So that makes scholars think, don't know. It shows up enough in the early documents that what they decided is let's include it, but let's be honest that some of the earliest copies don't have that in it. So you can see there's integrity in how they're putting it together. The other one is a bummer because this is like one of my favorite little stories in the whole of the Bible. This is the only other place where you'll see this is John 8. Or I think it's actually John 7:52 or something it starts. which is the story of the woman caught in adultery. Yeah, it's right before chapter 8. Again, you see that same thing. The earliest manuscripts and many other ancient witnesses do not have John 7:53 to 8:11. So the same thing happens there. There's some early copies that don't have this story in it. Now, the theory here is, this is the story where Jesus comes to the rescue of the woman caught in adultery. It's so clever, the story, that many people say, this has got to be Jesus. No one can make this up. You know how he stoops down and writes in the dust, and everyone, he says, anyone who's got no sin, why don't you cast the first stone? And they all get the guilt and walk away. It's brilliant. Who could think that up? So in a lot of ways, it seems to be, it makes sense, but it's just missing in some of those early copies. We've got thousands of copies of it, but some of the early ones, it's not there. Another theory is, excuse me, that perhaps someone was so offended at the idea that Jesus would let off somebody who committed adultery that they excluded that from their copy. And then that copy gets copied and so on. But again, the people putting the New Testament together are being honest about it, and they put that there. We're putting this story in because we think it's probably legit, but there's a question mark about it. So let's be honest and say it's missing from some early manuscripts. All right, that's the complete end. You've got those two stories which make no difference to any crucial Christian belief. They're the only two ones where we can go, we're not 100% sure. You've got some things that I would call apparent contradictions. They look like contradictions on the surface until you stop and think about it with the theory of looking at a car crash from 4 different corners. They're just recording different aspects of the story. The last thing we're going to do is the comparison of the number of the New Testament text to other literature from that era. Can you see the table I've got called Comparison of the New Testament with Ancient Literature? You can see there is no comparison. We have 24,000 copies, documents. Not all of them are complete copies of the New Testament. Some of them are fragments, some of them are books. 24,000. The nearest one is Homer's Iliad, that's got 643. So an enormous amount of copies. Now, the good thing about that is if you line up 24,000 copies next to each other, you can check if there's variation in it. So we've got the passing of time, and we've got 24,000 copies to compare, and there is no doctrine under question. I've shown you the 2 biggest passages, and there's honesty about them. We've looked at the fact 3 different writers are writing the same stuff, and the things that look like contradictions can be resolved. The best thing of all is the short time elapsed between when the events happened and when we've got an early copy, because that shows there's not time for the Chinese whispers things. With the New Testament, only 25 years. 25 years from when the events happened to when we have the information written down in written form. We obviously don't have a copy from like 60 AD. At the earliest one is 125 AD. But remember, John dies in 98 to 100. We're only 25 years after that. So even John's contemporaries are still alive. We've got copies from people who probably sat at the feet of the Apostle John. We've got copies from while they were living. So to me, that's incredible. There is no space for the documents to be changed. The idea that the Bible has been changed down through the centuries and how everyone jumps on that bandwagon without ever having the intellectual honesty to go and check it, it's just a complete fraud. There's no space for that to happen. You can have absolute confidence that the New Testament that we have today is highly, highly accurate. And wherever there are question marks, the people compiling it have been honest about that. And anything that I haven't told you is so trivial, it doesn't matter. It might be a plural instead of a singular. It might be a misspelling. It might be a point of grammar, but there's no significant doctrine under threat. Questions? Anything? Comments? All good? There's one last section I had there. 8:45. Have you had enough? Want to try and whip through the last little bit on the historicity of the resurrection, or is your brain full? Have a go? All right, I'm going to do a really quick 14-minute run through, which is ridiculous, but what can we say? Is the resurrection of Jesus an historical event? Well, of course, you can't totally prove it because people are just not going to accept it. Because scientifically, we know dead people don't come back to life. We're claiming a miracle, and you're not going to be able to, at this stage, verify to anyone's satisfaction that it was real. But I think if you're prepared to look at the evidence, it seems reasonable. So let's have a quick look. What about if we look at the biographies themselves? What sort of indications of historicity are there? Well, first up, we've got things like the Gospels record that it was women at the tomb that saw the resurrected Jesus. Now, that might not sound like a big deal unless you're a Jew in the 1st century AD who did not accept the testimony of a woman at all. So if you were like a woman couldn't speak in court, you're sorry, ladies, but your testimony was, it's a woman, forget it, not worth anything. So it's interesting again that the New Testament doesn't set itself up like you would expect of a fake document. It records the testimony of women. Also, how would you explain, this is very important to me when I got saved, how do you explain the disciples all running away in terror and leaving their mate Jesus to be beaten and crucified, and then suddenly on the other side of the resurrection, they're absolutely fearless? Like, they go preaching everywhere. They don't seem to have fear. They're thrown in jail. They're beaten, whipped. All of them except John die horrific deaths. And even John, he was thrown into a boiling vat of hot oil, just burned him horrifically, and somehow he lived through it. And they put him on the Isle of Patmos, where he died a natural death, whatever that means, after you've been thrown into a vat of boiling fat. None of them said this isn't true. How do they go from cowardly, running for their lives, to being these unbelievably courageous people? How would you explain that if they haven't seen the resurrected Jesus? Like, they all go to these gruesome deaths saying, we saw Jesus alive. It doesn't make sense to me that they would lie, or that all of them would be able to, like, I might be tempted to lie sometime, but if you start sawing my arm off, or, nailing into my wrist, and I'm in that much agony, you're like, I think the truth would probably come out. I would think one of the 12 would crack, wouldn't they? Don't know. And it wasn't just the 12, it was all the believers. Like, masses, there's probably some that gave in and renounced Christ, but it was huge volumes of the early Christians were martyred, weren't they? died horrible deaths. How do they go from cowards to courageous? Some other things we can think about in trying to verify the resurrection is, well, what happened? Some theories against the resurrection. Some people have proposed this thing called the swoon theory. That's the idea that Jesus was in so much pain on the cross and after the lashing that he passed out. They put him in the tomb and then he came out alive and like he resuscitated later. So he wasn't actually dead, he just looked dead and he comes back to life. But that doesn't work, because if you've been lashed, like historians record, they could see the organs in your back. If you'd had the 40 lashes, like, well, they actually made it 39 because they thought 40 you'd be dead. Very kind of them, they spare you one. Like, it's a lash with multiple tails with bits of steel and bone in it, designed to catch into your back like a fish hook and rip the flesh off. So there's records of people being whipped, and they record we can look into their internal organs through the rib cage because there's no flesh left there. People didn't get the 40 lashes, the 39 lashes too often and lived. Paul said he had them a couple of times and lived, but that was unusual. Most people died after. So the idea that Jesus had these lashes, then they've nailed him to the cross, then the soldiers put a spear in his side, he passed out, they put him in a tomb, and somehow he like woke up and he was well enough to go and impress all the disciples that he was resurrected in glory and power. It doesn't seem very likely. Like, if you could hobble out of there holding your injuries or something, but I don't think you can impress anyone that you were resurrected after that, could you? No chance. So that doesn't make any sense. And there's more arguments why that can't be the case. Like, he's mummified in 75 pounds of spices and bandages. Like, how does he get that off? Makes no sense. Another theory is a hallucination theory. But the problem is we got multiple witnesses across 40 days, and at one point, 500 people at once see him resurrected. I've never heard of 500 people having a hallucination at once. Like, hallucination's a one-off thing, isn't it? You don't have 500 people hallucinating that Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, has appeared to them. And if that was true, it would be easy. Like, this is, the Jews are worried about everybody going to follow Jesus, right? And a new religion forming. So all the Jews had to do, I'm talking about the Jewish religious leaders, all they had to do is go get the body and produce it and go, look, here's Jesus. He's flipping dead, all right? Here's his body. He's not resurrected. And that would be the end of it. Everyone could go home disappointed. But they never did. Another theory is the wrong tomb theory. This is the idea that 3 days later, the disciples all go to the wrong tomb. It was empty. Jesus isn't there. Yay, he's resurrected. Well, they must be pretty stupid to give their life to that, just go to an empty tomb. Besides which, and we've got it all in the scriptures here, the tomb was marked with a Roman seal. There was a guard, like a squadron of soldiers placed there. It was a well-known tomb, the tomb of, I think is it Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea? Can't remember now. A well-known family tomb, so people knew where it was. Once again, if the Jews wanted to crush this idea of Jesus being resurrected, they could just go to the tomb and get the body and produce it. The end of Christianity. The next theory, these are all the big theories that propose what happened. The theory that the disciples came and stole the body. Well, how did they get past a crack unit of Roman soldiers who would be, if they lost their prisoner, they would be burned alive. That was their punishment. If they ever lost them, they would actually burn them in their armor and in their clothes to make the fire. So not likely they're going to let a couple of fishos get past them, hey, when they're professional soldiers. Like, Peter, James, and John show up with a mullet each and try and hit the Roman soldiers, get the body, and run away without any Roman soldier getting them? I don't think so. However, this was the cover-up that was used by the Jewish leaders. If you look in Mark 28, it says that this is what they told the soldiers to do. That an angel came, there was an earthquake, the stone rolled away, the angels appeared, that the Roman soldiers were terrified, and the Jewish leaders paid them to say the disciples stole the body. So that was actually the first kind of cover-up. Again, another theory, it could have been a deliberate lie. Well, why would the apostles die for something they knew that was a lie? Or it could have been a myth. Well, how could a myth grow up while the apostles and eyewitnesses were still alive to challenge it? So when you look at all the possible options of what happened to Jesus' body, Christianity could have been easily stopped in its tracks, it seems, unless Jesus was really resurrected. And again, if we go to eyewitnesses, they died, they gave their life for their testimony saying this really happened. And Christianity became enormous from those people who saw Jesus alive after he was dead. One last thing here, and we're done, and that is a recent accusation against the resurrection of Jesus of somebody I've got all the info here. Basically, I'll just give you the short version. There was a documentary in 2007 on the Discovery Channel with people claiming they'd found all the coffins of Jesus and his family, but the names are wrong. And to sum it up, you can read the whole page there. I've got all the info. Israeli archaeologist Amos Kloner, who was among the first to examine the tomb when it was first discovered, said the names marked on the coffins were very common names. I don't accept that it was used by Jesus or his family. The documentary filmmakers are using it to sell their film. So it was all a big fraud. If there was any substance to it, you'd still be hearing about it all the time. Like, what an opportunity to write a book, make a movie. We can disprove the whole of Christianity. If it wasn't easy to write off, we'd still be hearing about it. But all sorts of scholars have just said it's a complete hoax. So that's as far as we're going tonight. We got through a lot. Probably need to go get a lie down after all that information. Any questions about that stuff or comments about the last bit? All pretty straightforward.
That was awesome. Thanks, Wes.
What's that?
That was awesome. So good. Thank you for that.
Cool. Hang on to the notes or file them somewhere if you can, because they're good to recheck. I've checked them lots in moments of doubt where I'm going, oh, like something happens to me and I'm having a whinge about being a Christian or something. It's good to go read that stuff and go, you know what? I've got no reason to think this is pretend. It's like, this is legit, and it's so awesome how God has given us external information as well as the information inside the New Testament. Just gives you such confidence that we're not dummies to be Christians. So have an awesome week. Make a lot of money, Sophia. Go get rich.
Thanks, Wes. You too.
All right. See ya.